and he's going to be presenting on the rule of cool, how freedom from rules uphold D&D bias in the tabletop RPG space. Take it away, Pierrick.
Thank you. So hello again, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Pierrick Simon. I'm a philosopher and I'm a big fan of TTRPGs, mostly because I'm a big fan of D&D 5e, and that's what made me discover that type of games. So as a philosopher, my contribution to research on TTRPGs is to make sure that the concepts we use to think about that kind of thing is adequate, or they are adequate. And it's an interesting task in itself, but it's also useful for empirical research, because if we frame the phenomenon in the wrong way, we won't be measuring things correctly in empirical studies. So the conceptual challenge specifically that I would like to focus on today is the D&D bias that exists in the TTRPG space. And what it means simply is that D&D is a very famous TTRPG, so famous that it becomes very easy to use the word D&D as a synonym for TTRPGs in general. And I don't think it's just a linguistic quirk. I worry that we often rely on D&D as an exclusive point of reference to understand what a TTRPG is. It often becomes blurry whether we're talking about D&D specifically or TTRPGs in general. I thought that what would be useful to address that situation is to try to analyze the current discourse about D&D 5e while using a few notions coming from the philosophical discourse about the nature of games. I think that it can show how the current thinking maintains the status quo. The current thinking about D&D 5e maintains this bias. So it's not that easy to do this analysis because there's a lot of debates about the philosophy of games, a lot of open debates, unsettled questions. And it's also not easy for me to do because I'm a beginner in this specialized area of research. So I'm open to feedback about that specifically. But still, I hope that the general idea that I'll talk about can help us focus on the right things at least, and explore some interesting nuances that are sometimes lost. So then let's get into it. I think that what is pretty interesting is that if you say that there's something about D&D that you do not like, you're told that you can change it. Either as a dungeon master, you can change it, or if you're a player, you can go talk to your dungeon master and come to an agreement. So essentially, we're told that doing this kind of changes is the role of the dungeon master. And so we're told that we're lucky to already be thinking like a dungeon master if we're tempted to make adjustments, house rules, and homebrew, to create new content for the game as homebrew. And so we are told also a story about why that's the case. And the story is the following. D&D is a collaborative storytelling game, and the rules should not get in the way of a good story, because that's the point of the game. So this is where we get the trope of the rule of cool, which is the idea that sometimes you might want to ignore the rule as written, if you want, to allow for something cool story-wise to happen that would have been prevented by the rules. And then the thinking is that it's the role of the dungeon master to keep the rules in check because they could make things not fun, the rules. One thing to notice about this story is that it pairs up really well with a popular misconception about the relationship between rules and autonomy, which is that we're so used to rules being used by people who want to take away our freedom that we end up thinking that autonomy consists in having no rules ideally. But then usually we recognize that sometimes self-imposed rules can be good for autonomy by allowing options that wouldn't have been there otherwise. So then we begrudgingly admit, yes, there can be rules, but let's not be weird about it. And so the idea is, yes, we can have rules, but we shouldn't regard them as sacred. And so it creates a sort of adversarial, standoffish relationship towards rules, where we always say, okay, we can have rules, but they can't be sacred. Don't be weird about it. Don't be a rules lawyer, which is another trope in TTRPG space, which is a rules lawyer would be someone who argues for their literal interpretation of the rules extensively, and they do it for selfish reasons, which are linked perhaps to competitiveness or to gatekeeping. I personally worry that this adversarial attitude to rules perpetuate the hegemony of D&D by shifting our attention away from game design. Because if you think about it, all we are told with this story is that it would be bad if a game design shaped our agency too much. And so we don't have to wonder how a specific design shapes a specific type of agency. We're just told to worry that it can happen and to try to prevent it. So this attitude provides an incentive to refer to game systems, but only in the context of telling the story of how we manage to keep the rules in check. And so it provides an incentive to refer to the game system, D&D, only in the context of how we don't get stifled by the system. And so we do that. We tell a story of how we keep the system in check thanks to our personal virtue of openness and creativity. And paradoxically, this binds us to the dominant game system because it provides no incentive to explore how different systems might shape different types of agency. And so my idea would be that if you treat the game system as a pretext for play and think that your task is to make sure that it always stays a pretext for play and nothing more, then it never rises to the level of a text that you can scrutinize and critique and compare to other texts. I think it prevents you from seeking other games out of sheer curiosity, because if you feel boredom and frustration with the game, you might not have the tools to conceptualize that you are bumping against the limits of a particular game system. Because after all, why would game systems have limits if it's just a pretext to unleash your creativity? Like, your creativity might have limits, but why would the game system have limits? And so if you're frustrated, perhaps you don't recognize the limits of a game system as such, you're more likely to blame yourself and to blame other players and game masters for not being able to make it work. So then, if that's the problem, what is the solution? Well, I think the solution there is to recognize that rules are not the enemy of autonomy, Self-imposed rules enable autonomy by creating new options. Here, they're self-imposed simply in the sense that we don't have to play a game together, but we choose to. And so, yeah, the main idea is that there's a difference between holding rules as a sacred text and agreeing that rules form a text and not just a pretext. It's a text in the sense that the restrictions of the game system create the type of agency that you're free to explore within the game as a player. I think it creates a particular way of behaving within the game, which is also a particular way of perceiving and of caring about your virtual environment, your imaginary environment. And to think about games like that focuses your attention on game mechanics. It gets you thinking like a game designer. And once you're thinking like a game designer, you can start to notice some interesting things about D&D 5e, notably some things that are out of your control. So here's an hypothesis, a bit speculative, but hopefully interesting. And but first, some context to that hypothesis. So the context would be that story-rich games have game designers, and those game designers are in charge of a lot of things, but notably, they're in charge of both procedural authorship and of narrative architecture. So let me explain a bit. Procedural authorship is about how the rules of the game shape a particular behavior. It's a notion that we talked about it today. You have procedural rhetorics in the work of Ian Bogost. You also have a notion of procedural authorship in the work of Janet Murray, and I'm taking inspiration from things like that. Otherwise, you have narrative architecture, which I found in the work of Henry Jenkins. And narrative architecture is about filling a virtual space with story-rich encounters. So encounters that when you meet them as your avatar, it creates emergent storytelling. So those two aspects, procedural authorship and narrative architecture, they have to work together because procedural authorship determines the way you pay attention and narrative architecture provides things worth paying attention to. So to put it in spatial terms, procedural authorship determines how you move through the space, and narrative architecture provides the space that you move through. So they have to be a match for one another. Because the architecture has to match the way your avatar moves, and the way your avatar moves has to match the way the architecture is. But here's the hypothesis. In D&D, interestingly, the original game designer who comes up with the rules is in charge of procedural authorship, but then delegates the task of narrative architecture to the game master. So the game master is not a full-on game designer. They have limited control over game design. And so, hypothetically speaking, to access the full range of stories one could tell, they would either have to, the game master would either have to fundamentally alter the rules of the game, so to take control of procedural authorship, which essentially means to create a new game, which is not that easy to do. Or they would have to bypass the rules of the game as they play. And this is perhaps what could explain the rule of cool and why this happens, or why we frame that phenomenon this way. But then if they bypass the rules of the game, they would tell a story the way other medias tell stories and not necessarily the way TTRPGs tell stories, meaning the way procedural authorship and narrative architecture complement one another. The bypass option, though, is the option that a lot of game masters use. It's a lot of work, but they're told that it's normal, so they do it a lot. And with D&D 5e, they have to use it more often than not, because there's a lot of procedures. There's not a lot of procedures to match and to get inspirations from, because we're told that there are 3 pillars of play: combat, exploration, and social encounters. Now, there is a procedure for combat. You roll initiative, you go turn by turn, and you have combat-oriented abilities. But I would argue that there is no procedure for exploration and social interactions. So you have to make everything up from scratch, as if you were working in a different kind of medium. Now, it turns out that there used to be procedures for this kind of thing, because D&D used to be a dungeon delving game. And so there was a turn-by-turn procedure for exploring dungeons and encountering people in dungeons. And all you had to do was to be the dungeon master. It's why it's called the dungeon master, right? You come up with a dungeon that fits the procedure of D&D. But that's not present anymore so much. There are gaps in the design, explicit procedures that are missing. Now, it might be the case that this lack of design has some accidental benefits, we could say unintended good consequences. It might be that these gaps in the design are bugs or features, depending how you look at it. But even if that is the case, I feel like the discourse that justifies this by shifting attention away from game design and by focusing attention on the opportunity to do a bunch of homework as the game master, I feel like this discourse is not necessarily helpful to have a good view of the situation. And notably, it prevents healthy frustrations with the game design to turn into curiosity, to go seek other games and see what they can teach us. As a conclusion, I would like to say one final thing about the D&D bias, which is that the way I described it is not the only way for the bias to manifest itself. Typically, an allergy to rules and systems develop after a period of dogmatism. So probably the D&D bias used to be more a traditional gatekeepy kind of dogmatism, which probably still exists today in some spaces, in some form. And so what I'm analyzing now is very focused on D&D 5e, and the discourse on D&D 5e comes late in the history of D&D. However, I still think it's important to notice how a purely reactive anti-dogmatism does not free us from the D&D bias yet. The only thing that can do that is game literacy, which takes rules seriously. So then I would like the takeaway message to be in the end that in order to free ourselves from the D&D bias, we need to think more like game designers and less like people who simply homebrew D&D. All right, thank you very much. That's it from me.